nhân cha thế cho phụ sẽ đời nó nè tôi này nó đã có tên chi này nó của pen này và má nó thiên nó cũng mấy thuộc phụ chứ sáng hăng và ít phụ hi rằng và đây là chỉ tôi nhà chỉ nên từ tàu đi xe ở trong vấn đề covid nó nếu có tàu tuần chi tôi hiểu bé sao này nó tàu là bé bảo bé chơi nhau từ tiếp theo sẽ liền thiên này nó thằng này bắt này nó chạy tàu này nó phụ hi professional Chekhov và Hickman là giờ thì tôi lúc đến hôm qua thì doctor chỉ nữ lì nữa nhớ rằng doctor chỉ nữ
nhớ rõ
ủa đi trả lời này nhớ trả lời
thế cũng nhớ rõ cái này cũng giải thích cũng chuẩn xe có chơi cũng tôn cho các thằng the na ya mana da shman da kaya takina zuriya ta shina cũng nhớ tìm cái thế cái ta shima cũng chuẩn xe có chơi cũng tôn cho các thằng cho áp khó hay cho mong ni kinh mong cái cái áp khó đó cái bên này á bên thứ sáu cho các một số này ở trong tàu là đó shima ví dụ có một tu COVID cái chúng ta sau cái cho các một số này đó shimaกูปนี่ที่กูจำไม่ยอมมาสักจะก็มาชวนนี่ที่ออสเตรเลียนะ
ลีเวลาเป็นยอดชอบกับปั๊มอยู่ที่กับปานี่นะเป็นดาที่ชิมาเลยใช่ไหมยิ่งเดียวเจ้ากูสนะจะยกการเตะก็เตะเลยเลยยิ่งเดียวทุกทีนี่น้ำเป็นนั่นเราจะได้ตัวบัดตัวนะโอเคดรชินูอย่างกูเตะวันเดียวอย่างปีนะกูเตะเลยป้อก็ได้ชี้อย่างเดียวเตะแต่ก็ไม่เหมือนอย่างเดียวพอถอดเดียวสุดท้ายโอ้ยก็em chỉ cho các lần gym không này ạ, ôi cái thổ thật cho các lần gym không này ạ, ôi cha có nhớ thứ có hai lần gym không vậy, em chỉ được bên không vậy.
So thơ xong cho cứ tu kiếm một bé Alaska na, Alaska ya ilu sinh的米个地那呢，ya ilu sinh mà bố sa cái地呀，cái cứ tu kiếm một nhà bé ở trong cái thầu của nhà bé mà của tuân chỉ áp từ phong nhiệt hóa cái phong nhiệt đó mà như có kia là Sacramento thì Fresno là California là chỉ một bé Alaska cái bé mà sinh chỉ cái là kiểu của một sai là ổn định áp khá là kiểu bé muốn trả là nó mà cái bé tụ phong nhiệt trong cái thà là khả năng là số thà cái đó màกูตู้มาอวบพงยังเห็นจอเลยเจแล้วมาเคกูมองยาละจิมแล้วลำละเตละจนลิจาเจเอาไปคันเดอกูจะต่อได้จิตคันเดอกูจะต่อทันเดอมากูน้องยังกูลีนึงก็ชงซึเจกูจะต่อนอดัวอีหาให้นึงว่าจิตต่อมัวลุเช็คกูจะต่อสาคันเดอนะที่ให้จะเกี่ยวจันทำละเตกูจะต่อเป้าสักคันเดอเฮียกูตู้เป้าไม่ไอซ์จะ the Vietnam War แต่ชิมาจะลิเปจะไม่ก็ให้ who the Vietnam War แต่ชิมาที่เทียนยันเดินยาละเตล who the American War แต่ชิมาเปจะให้สักคันเดอกูจะต่อเป้ารัชสักคันนะกูจะต่อเป้าให้เทียเปมีกันเตนะเปตู้มัวจอดีบลาเทียตู้มัวอีจงให้หนึ่งแต่เจ้าคิมบลาเขียนเนี่ยมีกันเตนะกูจะต่อเป้ารัชสักลูกเก่งกันนะเทียกูจะต่อสารต่อจะอีหาให้นึงว่าจิตตามว่าเทคเกี่ยวพงยินเดอแล้วเขียนต่อยาจกูเกี่ยวกับกูมัวลูเซียสากับ anthropology นะแต่จะยังให้ที่กูจะต่อจีเกี่ยวพงยินเดอกูจะต่อมูกันเดอเกี่ยวว่า PhD in anthropology นะ
เจ้าวันที่ถูกกันจีจะวันที่ถูกกันจีจะหนึ่งเจ้าก็ยังชิดต้องที่ก็ยังมูเกิดเนี่ยนะพอก็เกิดเนี่ยนะพี่เหรอก็ยังชิดต้อง
กูดูปีกับ psychology มันจีแต่ชิมาวิจารณ์กุนจีเชื่อข้า social science แต่ชิมากูจะมูกับอีกข้า class ใน anthropology นะแต่ชิมา
แต่ที่วันตะก้อนนะวันที่วันตะก้อนก็เดี๋ยว inspire แล้วก็เดี๋ยวกูชิดต้องมูเกิดจะให้หนึ่งห้องนะ
วิจารณ์เกี่ยวพงยินแต่อีลีปตากูให้แล้วให้จะข้าเก่งกูให้จะทะเลจุดเดิมละเตว่านี่ก็จะเชื่อละเนี่ยแล้วรู้เช็ค整大嘅要做全部有ลูกค้านะกูจะต้องกูทำได้กูอยากตัวตัวส่วนสิ่ง嘅กูจะต้อง包俾เจ้าคนได้嘅อยากอีกsurprise จากกูนะ嘅กูจะต้องสั่ง到做คนได้แต่是嘛แล้วเคกูจะแล้วมั่วกูที่นึงจะจ้องเห็นตัวนั้นหาจงถ้าแล้วเคละยังได้嘅 考 history 的嘛，古时候报一考早可能的是嘛，古字写很报名字报字早可能呢，第去当领的，那都教古木晒他说古木晒，我能要被阿拉斯加呢，给了教古木晒一首讨论我能给讨到今年嘛，你达到我能工作到今年到半年是他给你可以过还点哦，但是呢，到今年我哩那过点哦，古时候哪多哩呢？古时候包多哩给古时候包一度上面伢的钱呢，给讨古山。头古时看到，佢都冇老人弄到，當興就叫朋友的嘅，咧慢慢佢古就看到嘅古時啲哦，頭古就咁講到，啲就佢就冇只一阿邊度 anthropology professor 佢古面去做 culture 啦，嘅所頭嘛要Hmong culture 嘛，我個古字是包做 culture like culture in general， 但是嘛。頭古木跟得做技師做 PhD， 佢要使依個 culture， 佢要 specialize 啦。嘅頭做老師很得，佢使啲哦，為咗講蒙要學所睇嘛蒙冇做古老師寫個 culture 嘅，但係佢就冇出蒙解理嘅蒙理經驗啦。嘅頭老師很得，佢都啥冇做。這樣的 take on block， 但是嘛，頭路線很多也像你Apache，正式到開被就叫啲人想做多，出發蒙加利基嘅那嘅，古時候我出發嘅蒙一啲 take on block， 但是嘛，佢都冇就蒙一啲睇到阿上就啦，慢慢個蒙加利基嘅的 take睇啦。
Dr. Chino ก็ได้ชินขอมองขอกะลิเกจันแต่ว่าเราก็กู้เชียก็แต่กู้จุ่มเกินเนาะ
สุดท้ายอยากแก้วันนึงแต่是嘛透過OK 一考正經你嘅朋友仲係需要一啲頭一度啲人寫到PhD in the anthropology 呢，你要全部人的一個 community， 你要全部就一下係你要一項來一項到呢，嘅頭路線的古塞冇人的一路上冇人的這個態呢，嘅頭古冇全部就兩人的這個態嘅古喺度嚟啲考古曬除非人的給我哋夢想嚟嘅就給我哋直接呢。給來啲哦，有啲嗰陣嘅些夢嘅曬就給我哋直接佢全部曬論定啦，佢全部曬頭落係仔細啲風格，佢用嘅些係啲哦夢地主義就我哋直接上你家，來係做考正經係就給我哋直接啦，嘅湯德嘛。找路線的，但係佢啲嘛佢這些做考也係啲人的蒙解理嘅佢這些做看的，但是嘛考佢這些差不多，但是呢人的熱風格貼熱紫色貼熱的嘅貼，我能佢這些貼的是嘛？啲佢這些做考的是嘛？考佢這些差不多人的熱風格貼熱紫色啦。
แต่เขาวันนั่งเลยเจ้าเขาก็ปลอดตัวเจ้าก็ใส่แต่โอ้หมูแต่ชิมาถูกก็หมูป้อเขาวันนั่งกินมันเตาคอหรือคอหลังสีนี่อย่างนี้ก็ดีไซน์สีอะไรนะให้ตัวเก๋ตั้งแต่เจนี่ค่าย it's a deep อะไรนะ ritual นั่นก็มันอย่างไอ้ก็แทนมันจะเป็นจะ process ก็เกิดที่ใจนะถูกก็มันถูกติดก็เตะก็มันถูกมองยาติดไทยเตะเจ้ก็ลูกหอบเพี้ยมาเยอะก็ใส่ติดก็ซ้ำเกิดเช่นหนึ่งแล้วจีเจียไว้จ่าซึ่งเราไปอย่าง但是嘛哈 it kind of lead you to other path 的呀
Yeah 嘅頭路線的嘛佢都頭個邊呢用嚟佢都嘅psychology 一份嘅 anthropology 一份佢都知頭數睇樣的like combine anthropology and psychology 或嘅睇啲嘛考 research question 我哋插嚟啦，頭個邊嘅 PhD 樣的曬嘅夢的唔落地，頭落快惡種啦， ví dụ itu cái tin nhá khi muốn nhắc thì thay thế tạm mù lì nè đó là itu nu tin là nu khi muốn nhắc thì mình cái tên nè cái ở tu cái tin đó một trăm mình nhiều thiệt cái đó là cho mình nhiều yêu thì mình cái tên thiệt ít trong mình nhiều yêu thì thay thế cũng có research thảo luận hiện đó mà nhắm đó ship bị ở trong phong lần nên po ship bị cái nè ví dụ có ít trong khi muốn nhắc thì mình cái ít trong khi muốn nhắc thì thay lo cái cho cái nên chỉ chế bộ tự trả ra cái khả năng ít có research question gu chân chế vấn đề chấp了但是嘛头gu达到我找七分的给gu嘛包黑的哦这时候gu我 interview 找这样的嘛gu用天但是嘛也黑的gu是包梦都啥哩梦你注意正经chấp了还找给我能去接有就慢慢个日子赛呢ví dụ khi ra chỉ sai nữa mua phong cách nhớ cho họ cái vấn đề phong cách nữa mua thì tiền nữa muốn đào khó đó là mà nữa mua khó chỉ này nữa mua bị khó nhớ cho họ nữa hay cho chế sản cho nó cho mình nhiều cho sinh sự cho tự tin hơn thôi là mua khi cho lỡ hay tiền yêu chuộng ít tự tin chỉ chia lý gia thiết thầu hay con đỡ ta cái nhưng mà sao phong không mong lắm đó tự tin xia mua trong đó chế sản cho đó cái thầu cũng慢慢cái xia mình chỉ cho phong công đó cái cũng mà bảo hay tiền ô khả năng muốn đào ya hay cho cái ôn chỉ chia cho nó cả nè cái
保姆比较了，个系。
但是嘛，弟弟也係啲要三個是一部分播嘅，要 YouTube 個要真係啦，你哋知道真係，對着要正確當個是一部分播啦。
但是那個 since come brought into that subject，我要講個都係，就俾啲錢包，俾啲唔弄大啦，俾錢包啦。嗰時 more for example probably like give us a sample maybe a few of the the essential of the health the 我哋直接就會講啦 from in the simple language 你唔講係路啦都係使啦係路啊我哋係乜字嘅就呢normal 就呢特別大了錢嘅錢嚟呀
yeah 你問到呀กูยังก่อนนะเกถ้าเรากูมุ่งใช้แล้ววันนี้แล้วอีลุงเต็งเกถ้าเรากูมุ่งใช้แล้ววันลุงเต็งแต่ยังแต่เช็คไทยนะกูชินต้องการเสียแต่เรากูการเสียอีเป็นไม่ไอ้สิแต่是嘛อย่าพี่จะเขากูมุ่งอีตัว朋友หนูให้ใช้รู้จักกูหนูให้ลิกันนะแต่是嘛กูตัวมุ่งน้องแล้วให้จะจีใส่ดาวจอละcái chú giàu cũng nông đầu đua cũng nông cho sư phụ là bị mình chỉ cho cụ là hai cái thì họ chính kinh chấp là nhau họ từ cái cũng mà cái đó cái đó là nó cũng ít tu cái master student nó tuân cho cụ cái master's degree in the Brigham Young University Gulu University na cái nó luôn bây giờ dạy kinh sinh ba này à cái nếu như ít tu cái jali cái anthropology, ta chỉ mà jali cái Hmong na, nếu như ít sư phụ, bây giờ nếu bao đó nếu nhiều li bây giờ ta dùng sư ta chỉ mà nếu có knowledge nếu bao ý li ít tin nên tu cái đấy ilu nên na, cái nếu tu bao đó ya ví dụ có nếu tu sư phụ sai nếu tu cái na ya tu nếu luôn bây giờ sư phụ sống giờ sinh thái ya cái nếu ya ít tu bố thầu nhân đạo long kinh và bỏ nãy phong và bỏ tu mua ít khó competition cái sự tu sai lệnh tu ya tu bao đào cha cho mong cái cái na cái master sống giờ ya tu yang cái sự tu đó cái thằng nó khi là nhau mình cái tên nào nó sai ya kinh của nó tu cái nó khi nó tu cái đó sư phụ ya kinh chú khó cho nó có knowledge hay cho cái mong na cái con nó chỉ hay tia ya kinh ya tí tu sư và bao cho cái mong ta chỉ mà nó bao ít khó version nhằm để ít tu sư phụ chính kinh hành đó mà ví dụ coi nhà kinh nhà ít tu bao người ta cái anthropology thiên á nếu bao hai lứa anthropology cho cũ cái bao hai lứa mong mình chỉ cho nữa cái mới chỉ cho mới cho cái sinh cái sự giống nè cái thằng nữa tôi cho cũ.
Okay, go back to the question, but
oh, sorry, I'm getting back to it. I'm getting back to it.
Most of the nation, which I don't the normal language.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm trying to get back to. Go high cost story now. Be joke high dia. Jonguli yaking nunga shia jong anthropology jong li kya thiên nu za hai mi kya jong hang ne ya. Ke go ma go za hai mong ta shima go hai lu chi cho meng se. Ta shima go yang hai za hai a pe ya ya. Ke thao gun ja nu ka ke kya mong na nu mo zao ke khe jo gu kang gu nga shia jong do lu tu su fu khen gu na. Because it's sort of like he's able to culturally translate things for me so that it makes sense to me using metaphors in English, for example, right, when I don't understand the Hmong metaphor. Na ke video ka nu khete ya jogu te jo onde gun janu ka gunga sheli block your thing pose ke te jo nu khe jogu ta shina te jo gunga sheli shak your thing po za lu hapien da phong ka the lu hapien da ji sai jong ni kya na đó mà cụ tu cụ chỉ xong到了呢，cụ一直问姐教师傅包到在只在找了是谈的，了贴阿贝也正经就cụ在只在上你讲呢，cụ得搞了弄还得cụ吃饭只在上你讲。你那，这点嘛，也一早好了，你行啊，也一早好了，你行，你就是很大啊，是很大呀。
cái mùa trong thì cái mùa qua hậu lửa cái mùa tết chỉ tiền thôi, chỉ mong thay nhau sẽ cái mùa đó cái mùa bị chiếm lúc tết chờ lò mà.
The Thái Tây của tôi nhà tàu ở sông trong hông nhà tị Thái, cái nhà là Tây của tôi mua nhà tị rồi li bao li na. Cái suốt tết của tôi khi mà nhớ về suốt tết tàu ý xong cái trong mong nhớ thì mấy cái nào cứ lúc chơi nhớ thì mấy cái nào đó mà trong mong nhớ kia tới giờ thì ý xong tàu cái của tôi khi mà trong mong phát hiện nhớ tàu trong cái bao lì mù lò nè cái trong mong Australia của tôi mua siêu này thì ý lý sự đó mà sao cho các mù nhớ thế giờ nè.
Dạ chị đó chị nói chị biết cái chauffeur mong này cái là lỡ trở đi là hay cái chauffeur này thì có mong là có thứ là nó có thể là sốt tê nó là có một số sốt tê có một tầm mùa chauffeur sơ thì mong là có thứ là
be còn nói cái question chỉ kinh hay nè be tu bao kia hay tia mong kia là nhau sốt tê là đó mà có question thinking or page tàu bao ít bộ phận bộ ya nhân the long the thing to long the khó tu học số tế là nè ví dụกูtu muốn học cái mong ya bộ be ít khó giáo của Lý Giang cái Lý Giang ya sử dụng the Tibet nè cáiกูtu khi muốn trả lời nha chỉ tao khi muốn trả lời nha đó mà tu muốn học là ở bây giờ cái lời mong đa na, đó mà lời cho cái hai lời mong đa chỉ是动力海大是哪呢？比较快一点，我头一这就一波几条上到了哪里，一波上到了哪，他们给新到许多的路线规则，每一种梦开门呀，啥个地铁，每一种梦啥个地呢？给lời ya mu khi mu nya po pe shi jen de Tibet ta shi ma lời ya ít trong me na ke lo cha ke hal mong ma long ít tia na ke hal shi hal mong chi xin ga shi na yu chu mo ít phong yin za hal shuo vi jo khai tia lo cha ta shi ma khana ye go hai bi zu hai tia thầu mua cái sinh đầu sĩ tuổi nên cái bậc con như thế nên tôi nói là khi cho nên hạt tiêu ở bên kia là một số tê một trò nhà là tê một trò là tê một trò thay tê kia là nhà mình cái tê na,但是嘛可能要一开始啊，cái một ở bên cái khi một nhà ở bên khó na，但是嘛，
nhà chị bây giờ tiếng Hmong là origin from Tibet 呢。
Cú chỉ hai linh đó cú hay tiền nè nó mua giao phong khi mua nhà sĩ dân đó Tibet, đó mà cho lý cũng cái gì thảo ý lo nhà sĩ dân đó nè giao bọc con như thế thảo nè khi mua nhà bốn ra Patala na lo khi mua bố về Tibet na cú hai linh đó đó mà vấn đề khó lúc xưa đó bị tụ bao hay tiền mong phiền chung mà London这是我贵州了呀，对贵州贴阿贝鲁省nhà sĩ dân的贵州的，但是嘛，我哋这说北海，我哋北部了呀，北部上我哋路线的，北沿去包一部分部蒙了考到了我哋的呢，但是嘛，假说古人包呢，但是嘛。有去包人路说的，有去包还路说，有贴莫早给莫平时吃饭早考 question 的呢。
但是呢，这还没被 good trace back to 这边老说的是要不呀？你的是被 beyond that it's unknown, right?
There are many theories， 但是嘛，只么一头包一部%啊。
Right, yeah. 这里个啥呢？这里个啥个的 beyond that where do you know where did they come from?
Oh, yeah. It's a very important question, but it's very complicated.
Yeah. Sorry.
You
listed this in English, I think. Yeah.
So let me try.
It's important because the young one they really want to know and I think because you already did some research, so I thought I just wanted to pick your brain.
Yeah, some of this vocabulary is very difficult for me in Hmong. So let me explain sort of my version in English, and then we can go from there, if that's okay. So there are a couple of questions. One of the questions is the group that speaks Hmong. Is not so language groups and sort of like ancestral groups are not always the same. So some groups, for example, come on to take on the language of another group because one language is predominant in the area that they migrate to. And so one of the questions, I think it would be a mistake to assume that the group that speaks the Hmong language has been the same sort of like ancestral group all throughout history. That may or may not be the case. So that's one question, right? But I do think that there's good evidence. The best historical linguistic evidence we have suggests that the group speaking, the ancestor to the contemporary Hmong language was probably a little bit further north and a little bit further east of Hmong in southwest China, right? And in fact, what that research does is it compares Hmong to, say, Chinese and other local dialects, specifically with regards to local trees and plants. And it suggests that maybe about 2,000 years ago, going 2,000 years back, at least the languages being spoken from which Hmong descended and from which a lot of modern Chinese dialects are descended sort of had a common origin in, northern central China, somewhere in that region, right? So I think the best theory that I'm willing to say is probably likely is that Hmong descended from groups that sort of cohabited that region. And, there's a lot of people that say, well, Hmong get everything from Chinese and whatnot. I think I don't think that there's good data to support that. I think there's good data to support that both Hmong and Chinese kind of come linguistically and culturally come from a similar region with similar experience. And those groups that we now call Chinese and Hmong have been differentiated in more contemporary times, if that makes sense. So I do think that there's, there is Hmong folklore about having come from the north. And I think that there's something to that, right?
The reason I asked you is that because, we hear different story, that Hmong came from different parts. And I thought I just, since you are already, you do a bit of research, a lot of research on that. So I thought I would just get you
and there's a lot of stuff written about that. And if anybody wants to contact me and really do a lot of reading, I'm happy to give you some resources about those sorts of things.
We're going to move
on
to something. I think something a little bit lighter.
Yeah.
Okay, because you said it because you went to see the Hmong in so many countries, right? I think one question that I want to ask you is that, like China, the culture, like China, are they like the same or some of them sort of, modify into the region that they're living?
cái hay mong như mình nhớ lúc trước giờ nhỏ lớp bảo lớp bảo rong cái cái
thì có một hiểu mua vậy thì mua nhớ sữa tê nhớ protein nhớ thay tê nhớ là tê bị lấy chừng cái tiền lấy cái chai này vậy cho cái chai bây giờ cái hay nhụcตัวอย่างvậy for example vậy cái chai rồi say chỉ sai rồiแล้วพอจะให้อีหยาลอยเนี่ยให้เนี่ยหยาเนาะ
okay ขณะยาอีกข้อ subject กูเชื่อฟังดาวนะเท่ากูมูจู่ๆรู้เช็คเกี่ยวกูน้องอัปเปลาจ้าโอ้เท่านี้โอ้จีสันนี่โอ้จงนี่กันนะเท่านี้โอ้จัตเกนนี่โอ้จงนี่กันนะเกี่ยอีกข้อ so one of my important research findings ยันแต่
probably you can speak in English. I think there will be so the young one can understand. We probably switch to Hmong and English.
Yeah. So basically, the basic answer to this question for me, having done research in China, Vietnam, Thailand, also a little bit in Laos, and also in the U.S. and in France. The most, in Laos, Thailand, the U.S. and France, things are much more closely related, and Australia, right? And that's because there's sort of like a smaller subset of Hmong that migrated from Laos. Like it was a subgroup of Hmong that were all doing things very similarly. And there are differences too, right? Like there's Mongjo and Mongda, and sometimes, for example, in the New Year's rituals, when they do, sometimes Mongda do it's like the lakai where they have the post and they have like the rope, the braided rope, and everybody walks around it 3 times and then back way. Like most Hmongjua don't do that, for example, during the New Year. So there are differences within that community, but within the communities that left Laos and went to Thailand and migrated to the US, France, and Australia and other places, those are more similar. Once you get up to Vietnam, it gets a little bit more different and a little bit more diversity in the way that they do these rituals. Once you cross the border into China, it gets even a little more diverse. And once you get further up into China, it gets even more diverse. Like it's sort of like a lot of different versions in this. But the one thing I found is that the basic ideas hold for the most part in all these communities, even if the execution of the rituals is a little bit different. So, for example, one of these shamans that I interviewed, one of the Zineng that I interviewed up in this northern area in Lijiang by Tibet, they had this little block of wood that they called a lingpai. And I'd never heard of it before, despite having been to many, many shaman rituals in other places. And it had Chinese characters written on it. And that Zineng told me that without the lingpai, he would never understand or be able to understand what the Kuaneng or the tutelary spirits are saying to him. He said that a shaman without a lingpai could never really communicate with the spirits. And that was interesting to me because I said, well, I know all these shamans in Thailand and Vietnam and the US, and they don't have a lingpai and they seem to do fine. He's like, well, I don't know what to say about that. All I know is that, when I'm doing it, if I don't have the lingpai, I can't do it. Right? So that's one of those things that I think was maybe an adaptation picked up somewhere. Another example is most people know that, hupli kiteina, like tying the strings, that's very much a practice. If you go further north of Laos, if you go into Vietnam even, or to China, if you say hupli kiteina, because that's a practice that was picked up. It's something that's done in Laos and Thailand, and it was sort of incorporated into Hmong ritual. But that doesn't change the fundamental idea behind huplina. Like the fundamental idea is still the same, even if things are added or changed or adapted. Another great example is
like when they after the hupli, they're still looking at the like shekai, that kind of stuff they still do, right?
Yeah, that's right. But they don't do the kite.
I suppose because, like you said, they incorporate with the Lao, the Lao tradition and the Thai, so that's why they have to keep it. Yeah.
And another example that's not necessarily incorporating another tradition from, another group, but it's still an adaptation is, when Hmong came to the United States or France or Australia, you didn't have a choice most of the time of how you build your house, and traditional Hmong house in the highlands of Thailand or Laos, you have the uphill side of the house facing the top of the mountain, and you have the khachongta facing downhill, right? And then you have, and then you have the kitchen over here and everything. If you move into a housing, you're assigned housing as a refugee coming to the United States for the first time, you don't get to choose which direction your house faces with regards to the topography. You just can't choose. And so some people I found would put their saka facing the main door of the house, saying, well, okay, it doesn't matter as much where the mountains are. Let's just put it facing the main door and treat the main door like the khachongta. And then some people would say, no, it's actually the topography and the mountains and the longme is more important. So let's put the saka on the uphill side of the house. So both of those, I think, are legitimate adaptations to new circumstances.
So
one thing about Hmong culture,
what is the right location?
I think both of those are right locations, right?
Because you know what, I'm facing by the way you first and I
you're
think
facing the main door of the house.
Yeah.
And I think that's most common. But I have talked to families where they're like, yeah, but the main door might be over here, but the mountain's over there, right? And so they do it based on the mountain. And I guess here's my point is that one thing about Hmong cultural practice is it's incredibly adaptable. Like one characteristic that never ceases to surprise me is how capable Hmong communities are of adapting to new circumstances. Yeah. There's something that's fundamental to sort of like, a lot of these cultural practices that on the one hand, you could see them as traditional and static, but in fact, if you look over a long period of time, they're incredibly resilient and adaptable. Yeah. And that includes the zisai and the fongka and other things. People are always making sort of adaptations to their new life circumstances.
I can see that, since we we have COVID I can see that a lot of our our practice has been accommodated, right? Probably cut down to the essential one. Like for example, right before COVID, right, you would not thought that a funeral can actually shorten into even like half a day or a day.
Yeah.
But now, people, they're actually adjusted because of the COVID and they can do it. And like you said, our culture is quite flexible. And we know that, the essential thing, I think the essential, ritual, the essential practice, it's not that much, isn't it? It's a social gathering that actually prolong the certain, like the funeral to go longer or the wedding to go longer.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's adaptations happening all the time, and there's also, one of the interesting things about COVID and the pandemic is there's also a recovery of some of the older things that haven't been done for a long time. So just 2 weeks ago, I went with Sufu Yakeng to Minnesota to perform what's called a Tsisai Plina. So the regular Tsisai, when somebody just passed away, you call it Tsisai Tua, but the Tsisai Pli is sort of a mix of a jopli and a tsisai, but it's for somebody who passed away, not just a couple of days or weeks ago, but for somebody who passed away months or years ago, right? And this was something that Hmong people would have had to do a lot in the refugee camps because all these people died in the jungle and when they were fleeing and never had the opportunity to receive a proper funeral. So they would do this whole wave of tsisai pli for the people who died in the jungle to still provide for them a proper funeral. And what the interesting thing that's happening now is this is starting again because you had all these people who died during COVID and were never able to receive a proper funeral. And one of the interesting things there is that Sufu Yakeng, he's performing he just started performing in the version that Master Shongze had collected and sort of like stored and passed down to him. But yeah, that's just an example of how sometimes even old knowledge has to be brought back for new purposes, like the adapting to the conditions of a pandemic, for example.
Mm-hmm. So now, like I said before, because you travel around the world and you can see the Hmong through, right? Probably like an umbrella to see the Hmong in different region. And you mentioned that, even though the practice is different, but, we still have probably the moral or the what do you call it? Like the
core idea.
Yeah, it's the same, right? What about language? like language. Can you? I think like you said, you mentioned before that the language is also part of the region that you live to. Because you tend to pick up a few of the like when we pick up a few words and we add it to a Hmong, and then that become the Hmong language. But if you go to Vietnam, the Hmong Vietnam, they will not understand you.
So if you've never, so itu munda na ke ka mun che itu munda nyati nyalate ke tu munda nyalate chita, like has never seen any Hmong American movies. And one of the interesting exercises is just trying to set an appointment with them, right? Set a time and date to meet. It's very difficult because if you're Hmong nya mikatela nya Australia and you're speaking Hmong, you're like, oh, kapo kong van sao na. Van sao na, van sao po tao I chi Hmong na, tu kya la o I feng the gay hai lu Hmong ta shi ma po tao I ma van sao gu ya lu bla na la ya lu tai na. And so those are sort of, and that's one thing where Hmong, in every place where I've done research, they're always incorporating time and date reference points from the language, the majority languages in those areas where they live. So in Vietnam, they're more commonly using Vietnamese reference points for time and date. But then in China, it was interesting because I had to learn how to do time and date in Chinese to be able to make appointment or to talk to people in this Hmong community about those things. But I actually realized that they actually have sort of like a non-Chinese Hmong way of doing time. And this was one thing that really blew my mind. This was research I was doing in 2019 in China, right before I came back, right before we visited you in Australia. But they would say, iku, aku, beiku. So a ku, like a market, it was based on a 6-day market cycle. And so like iku would be 1 6-day period. And the reason it's 6 days is because their market cycle basically rotated. I mean, it's a little complicated, but to put a long story short, it rotated it. They had 2 markets on each zodiac calendar cycle, which is a 12-day cycle, right? So, and basically life in these rural places revolves around the market cycle because on, nui, the ikuna, nui, lukunyanda, lujanta, luja e, peyo helinda, ke nuti ana, lu market nyanda, luja b, ke nuti pe, lu market nyanda, luja c, na. So it's each day of that 6-day cycle, the market is in a new location. And people talk about time in terms of where the market is, because it would be sort of like, the market rotates in each village, and each village would sort of have 6 market days that revolve around it where people could go buy and sell goods and livestock and, trade across the border in these different places. And that's not to say you couldn't go to a market somewhere else, but that's the local reference point for doing time. And that was very interesting to me because I'd never seen a Hmong version of how to talk about time that wasn't pretty much sort of using either Chinese or Lao or Thai or English.
So,
right?
So in conclusion, do you think that in a Hmong language, we never have the version of like time, like the word of time and date?
No, I think that they do. And actually that's, I guess what I'm saying is the thing that really surprised me was that this was sort of like, for lack of a better way of describing it, it was an indigenous Hmong way of doing time using this market calendar, because people would also use Chinese to talk about time and date, but it would be sort of like a different system. Yeah. Right?
The reason I ask you is that because nowadays, right, I think they invented a new word for, say, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Yeah. Right? They invented a new Hmong word for that, and which is
But at the end of the day, that's still using a Gregorian calendar, right?
Exactly, right. They would say something like, a Hmong day. You say Monday, right? Say Hmong day on Monday. They have a name, but they still have Monday attached to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was interesting is in one of these interviews that I was doing in China, we pulled out a calendar, and this guy, the village, to Puyaban, but he's not the Puyaban because this is in China, but the headman of the village, he had this calendar that had the Gregorian calendar, and then it had overlaid with that was a Chinese calendar. And the funny thing is, he was talking about the Gregorian calendar as it was the Chinese way, the Gregorian calendar, and then the Hmong way was according to this zodiac system, right? This 12-day, and it maps onto the animals in the zodiac system and so on. But from their perspective, that zodiac system, that was very much an indigenous Hmong way of doing time, was what he was describing to me. So
right. So
anyway.
So in your opinion, what should a young Hmong, right, like a typical young Hmong, what should he learn about the Hmong culture? What are the essential things that a young man, a young Hmong man must, embrace or must learn?
So is it, you asked me, you told me to think about this question. Do you mind if I share a quick image?
Sure, yes.
Is that all right?
Because like the young people, they're asking me, well, we have to learn how to hupli, and then what's the other thing, but like hupli, how do you hupli? Now you can actually learn that through YouTube. And then, could be a suka. Yeah. How do you do a suka? That type of, but what is the essential that I thought, maybe you can share with us?
Yeah, actually you have screen sharing disabled, but that's okay. I'll just describe this image that I'm looking at. I like to draw this graph on the board when I'm teaching like Hmong classes about Hmong culture in my teaching at the university. And I kind of like, I guess one of the important things for me is understanding kind of the basic ideas, like, you huplina gu yai kajong tashima yati you chita hupli you to kengna tashima yung gashi luchi chenking yanda hupli jonika gu yai kajong na. So I think if you learn not necessarily how to say or perform all of these things, but you learn the basic idea behind them. So quick story, I was in France at a funeral, in a Hmong community in France at a funeral, and Taulushi handa ma latata hai fonka na ke gumunja itun sai lo deja no li go chi xiong na ke nu yang mong fa ki ke nu chi chu za hali mong da shba za me za ke gu chi za halu fa ki ke gutun janu halu mong na ke talatata hu fonka hai fonka na ke gutun nong ja tun sain da hai te kapapalo ora chi da sina kapunga shi jake ke na joni kya ne te sha la po neng po ya.
See, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And so she thought that, I don't know, is this a shaman ceremony maybe? And the sad thing that really sort of broke my heart in this moment was that she was a granddaughter of the man who had passed away. And this was the very first instance of her grandfather sort of blessing her as one of his descendants and now as an ancestor. And there's all these rich, beautiful blessings. And I think for her, I guess I wouldn't want her to necessarily learn how to say the Fongka herself. But I think, I think it'd be very important for her to understand at least the basic idea, to where she can understand the gesture that's being made, that her grandfather wanted her to have these blessings and can still, I guess, love her and care for her as an ancestor, and that he would want her to still love him and care for him as her ancestor, right? And so I think for me, it's less, the thing that's really important is maybe it's critical that there's always a group of people willing to learn and perform and be able to undertake these rituals for people who want them for themselves. You always have to have a group of people to do that. But I think it's also important for, even more broadly, for people to understand and being able to talk to their elders and talk to ritual practitioners to understand just the very basic idea of what's happening so that you can appreciate it when it's being done for you, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, that would be sort of the most important thing, is understanding the basic idea, because Hmong here might do it this way, Hmong in China might do it a little bit different, Hmong in Vietnam, and those subtle differences are less important to, most people in those communities. What's important is that you kind of understand the basic idea and understand how, those rituals sort of like have all of these beautiful poetic and meaningful moral ideas built into them, and being able to, at least understand the basic idea when it's being performed, the type of, Hmong knowledge that's being transmitted from one generation to another. I think that's the most important thing, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think that's an essential thing, right? Because nowadays, a lot of the young people, they tend to say, oh yeah, we don't know, we don't understand, because they speak in Hmong.
Yeah.
But I think that is an excuse, don't you think so?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you said,
Because yahiti yung gashi fong ka jong likiana, you Hmong jong jong na deja you ching gashi ipo feng po tashima tao yun hala haitia za jongoli o tao ka lua ka nie mo jo ka na ka shita za na ke ka mo ka nie mo jo ka na ke ka jo plata like mo te ya jongolinda deja you ching gashi ipo feng po bi jo ka ni ying mo I ka poetic language na tashima yahiti yung gashi ka basic idea. If you don't even know the basic idea, you may not understand anything. But if you understand the basic idea, you might miss some of the poetic turns of phrase, but you'll be able to follow it and understand the basic idea of what's being told. And that can be a very powerful experience.
So now, what are the critical practice that the young one, they have to understand, even though that it's not necessarily that, like you said, they have to actually engage in but they have to at least that try to understand why are they doing certain thing, right? So what are the main thing that you, in your opinion, you think that the young one should concentrate on? Like you said, one thing is the hupri, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think, I guess one of the basic ideas that is pretty important, that really kind of cuts throughout all of Hmong ritual, is the idea of, itutining tunjupli jonikiana. So, and this is one of the things, one of my hobbies as I go around all these Hmong communities around the world is always to ask my Hmong friends, so for example,
can you speak English on that? I think that would be very interesting for my young audience, right?
So how many souls or how many spirits does a person have, right? And I would ask, shaman, ask Yatineng, ask the experts, ask the ritual practitioner, ask like, the grandmas and like the kids, and just kind of see what people say. And people's answers would be all over the boards. Some people would say, oh, one person just must only have one spirit or one soul. And that's kind of like the Western Judeo-Christian ideas, like one person, one soul. And then some people are like, well, I listened to some of the ritual language. I think it's 3. And then some people, well, I've heard that like there's 36. And then some people, oh, I heard there's 365, right? And there's actual ritual language to support all of those ideas. But if you put the whole canon of ritual together and you start to analyze it, and this is one of those things that Master Shongze, the guy that won that ritual competition in Laos, that he did was not just memorize the rites, but start to analyze how these pieces fit together and maybe what a Hmong theology looks like. And from his work on that, he came up with the conclusion that there's Petun Juplina. And that's something, and actually I should say that in my interviews around these Hmong communities, that was the most common answer that I would get. Petun Juplina. Okay, and people would generally say, Itu jakamun japakoinso nya, itu jakala yu, itu nyanda lunzase tamuli. And some version of that is actually quite similar to the theology that Master Shongze developed. And this is all stuff that, Sufi Yakyeng has been teaching me as the purveyor of Master Shongze's knowledge. But, and this is, I want to be clear, there's a lot of different ideas about this. And this is not to say that this is the only idea. But one idea that makes these rituals fit together is this notion that you have one of the souls is the one that in the Jatake, it speaks to that soul and it kind of gives them everything they need to go back to live with the ancestors, right? And then the one that gets reincarnated is the one that is really kind of the subject of the Japli, for example, right? Well, okay, it's actually no. I got that wrong. It's actually mentioned in the Tisai, and there's actually part of the there's part of the sapli. Maybe you've seen it, where at the end of a funeral, you'll have some of the women in the clan with a danye menu, and they'll be kind of holding it out. Maybe the young people in your community have seen this before, but the idea there is you're sort of like encouraging the soul of the person who's passed away that's going to get reincarnated to come to back to your family and to be reincarnated into the next generation, right? So on the one hand, you have the soul that goes back to live with the ancestors, and then you have the soul that gets reincarnated, and then the third one is sort of like the protector soul, and it kind of lives at the grave, and that's actually the one that is the subject of the chapli. And that one, after several generations, will actually kind of transform into some of those house protector spirits, like the Davadache and even the Kwaneng. And so there's, it gets pretty complicated, but the notion that a person is made up of more than just one sort of like soul or spiritual essence, and that's what kind of makes it make sense to say, because I would ask all these people, okay, if there's three spirits, what happens to them, or what happens to a spirit when they die? And Hmong people believe in reincarnation. They also believe about going to the ancestors, and then there's all this stuff about like Da and so on. And understanding that there's those three sort of elements makes all of it sort of like make sense as a complete set of ideas, if that makes sense. And if you start to think about that, then you're like, oh, okay, now it kind of makes sense why the hupli works, and why you have these different things like the jatake and then the tisai and then the chapli later and all that stuff. Thinking about that idea, I think you're going to interview Sifu Yaking, and you should talk to him about this at some point, because he's the real expert. But that makes some of these ideas make more sense, right?
It sounds like more of your research is go towards the funeral ritual, isn't it?
Yeah. So, and again, that's kind of where, when I first really started paying close attention to ritual, it started with funerals, and I'm still on that 15 years later.
So
because
what
it's
about
so important.
On the other side, like the Yachong, that side? Are you on that as well? Or?
Yeah, I haven't done as much work with the Jachong. That's maybe the next phase of my life. We'll see. But I guess the other thing that I've done probably more work on that's outside of funerals is the New Year stuff, right? So the Hupli Pekiao and Nachi Pekiao and things that happen around the New Year, because again, that's a time when I've filmed different versions of these, and I'm considering possibly putting a documentary that sort of summarizes how Hmong people tend to think about, or at least how Hmong ritual relates to ideas about time and renewal of time. Because at the end of the year, there's sort of, if you've seen maybe people symbolically sweeping their house with branches and so on. You kind of sweep and gather up all of the bad things from the past, and you kind of let those things go, and you renew your saka, and you do all these things to sort of like invite new fate and fortune to come. And those rituals of renewal, I think, are very important, because that's one way that, and many different cultures have versions of this, but I really like the Hmong version particularly, where it's sort of like, you sort of like, there's all this rich symbolism about getting rid of the old and inviting the new stuff to come. And just sort of like, in the West, we have like New Year's resolutions and things like that. It has a similar idea and a similar ring to it. But the Hmong versions of these rituals, I think, are particularly powerful in thinking about, how we think about time, and how we think about trying to, renew important things in our lives, and maybe overcome, bad things of old.
Are you believe in the Hmong culture? It might be a silly question.
Do I believe in the Hmong culture? Is that what you said? Yeah. So, I'm somebody who has, as an anthropologist, I guess anthropology has taught me a lot of different things. But one of the things it's taught me is to be more open-minded than closed-minded, right? And I feel like there is, part of anthropology sort of like turns into like what we would call absolute relativism, where nothing is really true. It's just whatever people believe is what they believe. And that's not where I am. I do think that there is truth and beauty and moral goodness in the world. But I also feel like there's more than one version of that is legitimately true and beautiful and good, right? And I've learned things from Hmong culture that I think are not just true for Hmong people, but are true for me as well. Absolutely. And I guess my answer is a little more complicated than just saying, do I believe in Hmong culture? I mean, I absolutely believe that these rituals one thing that captures my attention about them is not that just that they're interesting from an academic perspective, but they're interesting from a moral and philosophical and religious perspective. And yes, I have learned truth from Hmong people that has affected me, not just in my scholarly work, but in my personal and spiritual
because
work.
The reason I asked you, it might be still, but the way I can see the passion in you, right? When you speak, it's like you're real Hmong, you're not just a researcher who comes in and do research on a particular, culture, and you live, and then you go and practice your own, belief. Because I heard,
I can tell you, I've had more than one person tell me that mine Juxian Jusha, which is the reincarnated spirit, that several generations ago I must have been Hmong, and that's why I'm so obsessed with Hmong people now. And I'm open to that possibility.
Because I think I have a story that even your family, like when you went to live with the Hmong, like they even perform different ritual to the family, to the children as well. So
we've had hoopleys done for us, and other things. We had one of the experts in France do kugong for my daughter when she broke her thumb. She got her thumb closed in a door, and I think that. I mean, one of the things is that with regards to Hmong healing practices, whether it's Oneng or kugong or other things, people do things and continue to do things because they have an important impact on their lives, including actually healing things, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to realize that, that's not to say that the world is perfect and everything works exactly the way that you expect it to. Of course, that's not the case. But at the same time, there are, even if you look at the modern pharmaceutical industries, where they get a lot of the drugs that they end up patenting, oftentimes they come from traditional herbal remedies that they just happen to put a patent on and make billions and trillions of dollars out of, right? Because they're capitalizing on traditional medicine. And I think, Hmong healers have been working at this stuff for a very long time, and there is something actually to it in terms of healing, not just in terms of, anthropological interest.
That's great. That's really good. And then we come to almost the end of our time.
Sorry, I talked too long. I have too much to say about all this stuff.
Fantastic. Is there anything else that you think that, you haven't covered and you think is really important for the young one? That they have to really think harder and get involved, and then like you said, you have to come to an understanding of what is really the household, like the household what is this ritual that as a family man you have to really know how to do it.
Honestly, I think like one of the biggest things is just to stay curious. That's ever since I first met my Hmong friends in Alaska, and they started taking me to Oneng rituals and telling me about the history in Laos. I've been my curiosity doesn't get quenched. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. The more I want to know that, I need to go spend more time in Guizhou and maybe learn another dialect of Hmong to answer some of those historical questions. But I think for the younger generation, just allow yourself to be curious and to spend time with, your grandmother, your grandfather, or maybe an uncle or an aunt or other people around you. Read books about these things. And I think that it's that curiosity because, one of the things that never, that really started surprising me and now never does because it's so common, is the extent to which a lot of the younger generation in all these different places I go, there are people like there are people who, don't know very much, like the young women I described in France, but I do think that there are also a lot of people who really want to know as much as they can, and it's just an issue of finding sources, people like you who are trying to create material to really educate them and help them find a way to pique their curiosity and to help them become even more interested in learning more. Because at the end of the day, that's the way that Hmong knowledge has been passed down in recent history, is through somebody who wants to know how to hupli or how to, say the tsai or whatever it is, and they go find a master and spend time learning from them to where they can master that knowledge and then be the person who passes it on to the next generation. I think it really is just about letting yourself become curious and wanting to understand more about Hmong culture and history. And if you're able to do that, then I think that itself will, help motivate you to learn the things that, could pass on your version of your family's history to the next generation and so on.
That's great. Now, how does the COVID, affected on your research?
So we were hoping to go back to the Hmong community in France in 2020. Then we were hoping to go back in 2021. Now we're really hoping to go back in 2022. We had hoped to go back to France in 2020, then Australia in 2021, and obviously that hasn't happened yet. But we've been still communicating with our friends and colleagues in France about coming back to their community. So we haven't been able to do much in terms of field work, but I've definitely been keeping in touch with people over Zoom and Facebook and things like that. So it is hard. Although I've been to a couple of funerals recently where I've been trying to learning a bit more about the specific details of the rituals, and I find myself learning a bit more now that things are opening up, at least a little bit more here in the United States. Unfortunately, I hear that's not the case in Australia. But
do you think that one day you might be able to perform this ceremony?
The Zisai? That Yang would like to train me to do that, and I don't know that I have the verbal skill to do it, but we'll have to see about that. I think Yaking would really like for me to be able to do that. And I would like to study it to that level, to where I actually understand not just the ideas underpinning and be able to hear it, but really get into like the chapter and verse, as it were. It's something, but again, it takes a long time, and it does. And this is one thing I would say for the younger generation. We tend to, in Western countries, Australia, the United States, Europe, we tend to put a high status on, I've got this big library of academic books here, right? We tend to put high status on the written word and books that are published and talked about and circulated. But one thing we don't realize is that the level of effort that goes into mastering and being able to perform something like the Tsisai, for example, which goes on for 6-8 hours oftentimes. And these are not repetitions of the same thing over and over. There's every step that you have to do, and it's a whole sequence. And understanding the ideas behind it, Hmong masters have been doing that for a very long period of time. And it is a high level of skill and verbal ability and memorization and intelligence. I mean, those people are scholars in the highest order. And we tend not to ascribe a high status to say, oh, Hmong is just an oral culture, as if that were anything less than all the works produced by these scholars who have written books on my shelves here. But I would actually argue that it's the other way around. I've published a large number of papers. I'm working on a book about all of these Hmong in all these different countries. But at the end of the day, I'll tell you the hardest thing that would take the most skill and the most time and dedication for me would actually be to learn the entirety of the Tsisai. That is a higher, more difficult, more challenging, and I would even argue more prestigious scholarly endeavor than most of the stuff that me and my colleagues are up to. And I'm serious about that. And one thing that we need to understand and value is the hard work that goes into that. That is if scholarship is dedicating oneself to study of a topic and mastery of a topic, Hmong traditional ritual practice is scholarship of the highest order. And I hope that the young people in your community can recognize that and value it as such, because it really is the case.
Right, and I'm sure that in the near future we'll have Dr. Chinuli as one of the in the near future. Right, there's no doubt. So I think I was going to ask you what's next for you, but I think you probably cover a lot of things.
Well, I really need to finish my book. My book is trying to sort of summarize a lot of these stories that I've been talking about, and I'm trying to write a book that is actually accessible to the Hmong community. One of the things a lot of the Hmong elders in the places where I do research tell me is that I'm so glad you're doing this research, because my grandchildren only speak Thai, or they only speak English, or they only speak French. And, I want people to be able to, I want them to be able to read a version of our culture that is, and I'm not saying I'm writing the end all be all book, but people tell me this a lot. And I take that quite seriously, that I'm trying to write a book that's not just for anthropologists, that's actually for as much for the global Hmong community as for anybody else. Hopefully, maybe someday Yak-Ging can help me translate it properly into Hmong.
Right, so I was going to say, in what language?
I mean, the first version is going to be in English, but I do take seriously the responsibility.
Have you ever considered written like a simple writing, with probably illustration, and then that will be probably easier for the younger generation to understand? Lots of pictures.
You mean in Hmong or in English?
Or in English.
Yeah. So here's one thing. I'm trying to write. The book that I'm writing will have, a chapter probably that's dedicated to more anthropological theory, right? But then I'm trying to keep it to that chapter, and most of the rest of the stuff is going to be stories and that about Hmong communities that tries to make the points I want to make. But if people are really interested in accessible, very rich material written English about the global Hmong community, I would strongly, strongly recommend the work of Kaukalea Yang. So she's written 2 books, she's written more than 2 books, but the 2 books that I would particularly recommend are The Late Homecomer and The Song Poet. And she's actually working on a 3rd book in the trilogy that's a memoir of her mother's life. Right. But her work takes the poetic beauty of, for example, Haigitsia. She takes sort of like the poetic beauty of Gitsia in Hmong and does sort of like a cultural translation of it into English, and it comes out poetic in English as well.
I have read some of her book. It's beautifully written. Now, when is your book coming? What's your do you have any plan? When will your book?
I'm trying to finish it and send it off to publishers for consideration of publication by the end of this calendar year. So it's the thing that's occupying a lot of my time at the moment.
Right.
So it's at least 2 years out in terms of being published.
So would you come back and then let us know in here?
Absolutely.
We'll come you back, and then we can go through your books.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we come up to the time now. Like I said to all my guests, right? I always end my interview with 3 words. Now, give me 3 words in Hmong that would best describe Dr. Chinuli.
Oh, deja lalu ti guyo hatia tuana. And it's a little bit of a joke, but I mean, seriously, the more I learn about Jatsi Saina, the more I know that when it gets down to every single detail, the how complicated it is and how brilliant these Hmong masters are, who are able to memorize it and perform it. Like it really is a feat. But I would also say maybe in Zixia, like I'm just always curious and interested. I always want to know more about Hmong culture and Hmong history. Like these questions you ask about like the original origins, somebody has to really like learn Chinese and learn classical Chinese to really get at those questions, right? And I don't know if that's going to happen in my lifetime. Maybe I'll have to die and reincarnate to do that in my lifetime.
Sorry, what's the second one? True. And then what's this?
Nzixia.
Z and Nzixia? Okay.
Nzixia. But like Lucian Nzixia, like a Nzixia as a disposition, like not that I'm an interesting person, that I'm interested in Nzixia bao zao deyan on ya. And I don't know. I'd say maybe lalu tipe tejo gu zao shi na. I'm just so grateful and content with my life. You know, I have the best family. My wife Brenda and I just excuse me. Mainsong na. So all our friends in Thailand know her as Mainsong. They don't really remember her name Brenda because, you know, I'm thinking of the Hmong community we've lived in Thailand for the longest time. But, you know, our Hmong friends have been there ever since our first son was 6 years old. His first word was Boku. And like, we love taking our kids around to these Hmong communities. You know, the Hmong community we lived in France, you know, they got to know our first daughter who was just a baby in their community. And I guess I feel incredibly grateful for the many friends and family that I have, and I count myself quite lucky and fortunate. And among my closest friends are some of, you know, my Hmong friends and that we've talked about, and the people who have just opened up their lives to me and my family to live with them, including we were just beside ourselves how your Hmong community in Australia, from, you know, Melbourne to Sydney to Brisbane and everywhere else. You know, we were just taken in with open arms everywhere, and it's just, we feel like everywhere we land, we have immediate friends for life. And I'm just, you know, it touches me about just like the Haining Hmong Ma Lucia Dana. So
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we're really happy that like you and the rest of the family come and visit us, and we are hoping that, you know, in the near future when the pandemic is over, Brenda and the children can bring, and you know, you can bring them back to see us. Everyone's asking for them.
Yeah,
right.
we can't wait. We can't wait, honestly.
Okay, chị trong đó nè, trong đó.
Trong đó nè.
Nè, chị quay sau đó thì okay, chị bé là lúc sau đó này nè, Professor Jacob Hickman chị hay thì chùa gì xia, vào xia, ở trong đó.
Okay. What's on there?
Okay, right. That's really good. So it like I said to my husband, that I said, I don't know what because like kapong tao told, I don't know what to ask you because you are such a knowledgeable person, and sometimes I feel really humble and probably, you know, ashamed to ask you because I'm a Hmong myself, you know.
No, not at all.
You know? Okay, so we'll talk to you soon, and then
this was a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, what do I come out at you know, jump in there, to show pen up. Okay.
Oh, we can't wait. We honestly can't wait. We've been keeping tabs on Australia to say, nah, we still can't go yet.
I know.
Okay, bye.